My name is Schnidman. I'm founder and CEO of Prattle. We are a financial technology company. So what we really do is actually falls more in the text analytics realm these days than almost anything else. So basically, we pull signals from noisy information. And really where this came from was a bunch of academic research that myself and my business partner, Bill McMillan, did analyzing things like central bank communications. Some of you might have paid attention yesterday when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates for the first time in 9 years. That's kind of a monumental day, right? I hate to break it to you, a quarter point raise doesn't actually matter, but we can get into that separately. So what I found in the process of analyzing central bank communications is that every time they talk about these things on CNBC, I wanted to throw things at the television. And I wanted to throw things at the television because they kept focusing in on a single word or phrase, largely to the exclusion of much more complex language in the rest of the communication. There's good reasons for this when it comes to press releases because the Federal Reserve uses track changes from one press release to the next. The problem is that this carries over to minutes releases, speeches, congressional testimony, and to every other central bank in the world that doesn't use track changes. So we ended up developing a mechanism to analyze complex, nuanced communications from these central banks in a way that yields quantitative data very, very quickly. Basically, many of you probably have come across other sentiment indicators and have said, oh, yeah, that's nice. It kind of gets what's going on Twitter. At best, maybe what's going on in an Amazon review. The problem with that is that with central banks, the difference between the word modest and the word moderate makes all of the difference, right? Modest is the 30th percentile, moderate's the 75th. Being able to pick up the difference in synonyms is vital. And so we had to develop a whole new way of looking at not just central bank communications, but language. And so ultimately what we wound up with is the first ever comprehensive, unbiased, quantitative central bank sentiment indicator. The odd thing about this is, of course, we ended up developing data that is not only useful to financial markets, hence we both left academia, but also developing a methodology that is useful for a variety of other things. So this is what our data looks like. This is pulled straight off of our portal. If I have enough time, I can pull that up as well. This is an example of the U.S. Federal Reserve, pulled this last night. And what you see here is actually how our data, how each individual communication from the Fed over the course of the last several months, in this case 6, scores. So that's what those blue dots are. That orange trend line is just a smooth trend line. And of course, at the bottom of the screen there, you're looking at the last half dozen scores. So what we actually find is that there are interesting systematic things about language, right? So central bankers, they're human beings. Big shock, right? When they use the word committee, they are disassociating. Committee is almost inherently a code for them being dovish. They are thinking the economy is going poorly. So ultimately, when they say I, me, we, they think the economy is going well. So obviously, as I alluded to before, this methodology allows us to sell directly to hedge funds, mutual funds, investment banks, etc. But we're also developing other data based on the same technology, looking at quarterly earnings calls. These are obviously relevant to people who invest in individual equities. Then, of course, things like 10Ks, 10Qs, and a whole bunch of other regulatory information. And then we also have a whole bunch of new GDP modeling that can be done off of sentiment-based data, as well as other forms of economic modeling. And before I go completely out of time, quick plug, Bill and I just came out with a book, became available on Amazon, I think 2 weeks ago now. So if you care about, interest rates, anything to do with central bank communication, or just curious about where the world of text analytics is going, buy our book. I think good amount of time. Questions? Yeah.
What are some kind of like actions that you would expect people to be able to take off this data?
Yeah, so the question is about what actions people take off this data. The short answer is we have several hedge funds in particular that are investing off this data, hedge funds, mutual funds, futures funds. They are taking a variety of actions. So central banks tend to be a leading indicator, particularly of downside risk, which allows them to hedge their portfolios. And also, based on established correlations between our trend, that trend, and various assets, you can actually predict asset prices. So what that winds up as is that literally people who invest in anything from fixed income to currencies to equities can actually predict where pricing is likely to go. Other questions? Yeah.
In building the model, you mentioned things like the word committee and modest versus moderate. Did you use a purely data mining approach, or did you hardwire the meanings, the values of any of those sorts of words?
We did not hardwire any meanings. In fact, quite the opposite. We actually trained the system based on market response. So in some sense, we're actually better at predicting market response than we are at actually predicting policy action. Now, the two are obviously linked. But what we actually did is historically, if a communication elicited a hawkish market response, future communications that look like that one ought to then be hawkish. But of course, there's a machine learning component to pick up new language, new phrasing, etc.
You've done lots of cross-validation to make sure that prediction.
Yes, lots of cross-validation. Not just cross-validation, singularly cross-validation for each of the 20 central banks around the world we follow. Yeah.
Is the underlying technology specific to central bank communications, or what other markets are you thinking of?
Yes. Yeah, so I'm an economist by training. I came at this trying to solve a very specific problem that pissed me off. And what ended up happening was we developed a technology to analyze complex, nuanced communication that changes relatively rapidly. As I said before, most sentiment analysis tools are designed for the opposite. It's very simplistic communication, sort of good minus bad. So one of the things, we're applying this right now in the corporate communication space, shareholder earnings calls. So we see the investor relations space as the next area of growth. We do operate in the finance space, so that's where we've been limited to right now. There's obviously obvious applications in the regulatory arena, legal, and then of course the intelligence community. In the back there.
Why haven't you started a hedge fund yet?
Do you have a hedge fund?
No.
Yeah. So no one who's ever started a hedge fund has ever asked me that question. No, it's a good question. It is. I say that somewhat jokingly, but there's a single signal does not make it a hedge fund. There's a lot more that goes into it, and frankly, if you want to start a hedge fund today and you have less than $400 million under management, you're going to really struggle. That's a lot of money to raise. So those of you other entrepreneurs in the room, imagine trying to raise $400 million tomorrow, and that answers your question. Yeah.
So mostly you look at the public data.
So we look at publicly available communications, so everything that's officially released from these central banks, and that's largely for compliance reasons. We actually have been commissioned by several central banks to help them craft communications to elicit market response, which is a little bit weird. You can play both sides of that fence really quickly, but that's sort of the play in the investor relations side as well. But we of course can't make that information public or part of the data we sell.
That was my odd question. You buy the rumor, sell the fact. Why, if you can figure out how to convey sentiment, then why can't the conveyors figure that out too?
Yeah, you would think that. The truth is that that's not what they're focused on, right? So
central bank's not focused on conveying sentiment?
Their communications department has grown by leaps and bounds, so don't get me wrong. They're better than they were 15 or 20 years ago when they had no transparency policy. But they have a long way to go, put it that way. And especially, and that's not just true in the US, that's especially true most other central banks in the world. I would say, with the possible exceptions of the Swedish Riksbank and Reserve Bank of New Zealand. Yeah?
Speaking a little bit out of my wheelhouse, do you see this tool being used with a person in the loop, or using used in high frequency trading?
That's a great question. So the question was about whether it's a discretionary tool, a tool for somebody who's making a decision as a person versus an algorithmic decision. The answer is both. The front end portal that we have is for discretionary traders. It allows you to scroll through and look at all 20 central banks we cover on one screen. So you know that you have to pay attention to Turkey today, but not to Taiwan. That's a discretionary tool. We also have a back-end API that feeds directly into a quant system. That is actually how we started the company, was purely as that back-end data feed. So, yeah.
Is this at all like NSA's Prism software?
Oddly, that is the second person today to ask me that question. The short answer is no. The longer answer is yes. But let's follow up on that one after I just got the last question assigned. So, all right. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks.